And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for rejoining us. I'm delighted to be joined by Christine Tan. Christine is one of the co-founders of Idaciti. She's also a lecturer and importantly, obviously, an Aussie, but she's based in the United States and is also on the board of Expel International. But Christine is very focused on the way that investors utilize information. And for that reason, she's going to be giving us a rundown in that area.
Okay, so just in terms of level setting, I wanted to draw your attention to the recent final report that was published by OICV and IOSCO. And the title of that report is Environmental, Social, and Governance Ratings and Data Products Providers. And I wanted to summarize some of the key findings that this report found when they surveyed the marketplace. The first finding is that there has been a lack of transparency with regards to the methodologies that these data product providers are using when they are generating their ratings or providing or collecting the data. So lack of transparency has been a key issue. The other finding is that there is potential conflict of interest between the management of companies and the ESG rating and data providers themselves. And this is because the ESG rating or data provider is the entity that is providing these consulting services to the very companies that they are rating or collecting data from. So there's a potential conflict of interest. The next point I wanted to make is that the report found that there has been a lack of clarity and alignment of definitions, specifically including how the ratings were generated, what they were intended to measure, and also the data products as well. So lack of clarity and alignment on the definitions. And then finally, the other key finding is that they found that there is uneven coverage of companies. So in other words, certain industries or geographies were emphasized more and other countries or industries were not covered at all. So based on some of these issues that the report found, the basic question is, how do investors and stakeholders obtain reliable, comparable, consistent, and transparent data to make informed decisions? So in terms of the sustainability mandates that we have around the world, there's been a lot of discussion this morning about the EU initiatives, and with the CSRD in the UK, we have the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Report, the SECR. In the US, the session right before this, there is a lot of discussion on the proposed climate rule for where companies are required to disclose their scope emissions. And we have a final rule for where companies have to disclose their pay for performance for executive compensation. There are also sustainability mandates in Switzerland, India, and Japan. And other countries, there's ongoing discussion, movement towards requiring sustainability reporting in Canada and Australia. But at the heart of all of these mandates is XBRL. So these regulators and jurisdictions around the world are recognizing that it's important to be able to digitize these sustainability reports. So that's just an overview of what's happening around the world. And the basic question is, why should we be digitizing sustainability reports, and why now? Well, from my perspective, the timing is perfect. It's right to discuss structured digital reporting for sustainability disclosures. And this is because the sustainability standards are evolving, and so are the reporting behaviors. And while the standards and reporting behaviors are evolving, it's important to keep data structuring considerations front and center in mind. And it's important because investors right now are clamoring for this data. They want good, high-quality, structured data to consume so that they can make their informed decisions. It's important for companies as well, because as companies are putting together their sustainability disclosures and benchmarks, they need to be able to assess how they themselves are doing in progressing towards meeting those goals. They also need to be able to assess how their peers are reporting these sustainability metrics. and disclosures. It's important to have digital reporting front and center right now because there is this lack of standardized reporting, right? And digital reporting will help, encourage that standardized reporting. And then finally, more importantly, there is a lack of transparency in the sustainability ESG data space. So now is the perfect time to consider data structuring as the standard setters around the world deliberate on standard setting. And it is a very different world we live in today compared to when XBRL digital reporting was first introduced for financial reporting. There are many, many lessons that we have learned, and especially here in the US, we have over 12, 13 years of lessons that we have learned. And what I have learned as having been part of the Financial Accounting Standards Board taxonomy team and being involved with XBRL for financial reporting over the years is that what we're seeing is that XBRL, once the data is structured, can provide a very timely feedback mechanism to the standard setters. And there is anecdotal evidence that the FASB team has been doing a lot of analysis with the XBRL data and providing that feedback in terms of the new accounting pronouncements and how companies are implementing and reporting in accordance with the new leasing standard or the new revenue standard back to the standard setters and providing post-implementation review analysis of these introduced standards. So the standard setters benefit from this as well when the data has been digitized. And so the importance of structured digital sustainability reports for consumption from an investor's perspective, we know that investors need data that can be easily consumable. Investors need accurate data. That is a must. They need timely data. They need transparent data. And the last point I want to make is that they need data that can be commingled with financial data. Because as we all know, that investors, when they're making their investing decisions, it's not just financial data alone, it's not just sustainability data alone, it's the commingling of the two data sets. And so here we have the perfect scenario of why the case needs to be made that sustainability reports and data needs to be digitized using XBRL because financial data in many jurisdictions around the world is already being tagged using XBRL. So this leads to the next, point is that from a company's perspective, for them to use XBRL and apply XBRL tagging to ESG, because they've already been doing this with financial reports, that additional step that they have to make is not as onerous. Now, from a consumption perspective for companies, oftentimes what we hear from companies is that, who is using this data? But what we've learned from the US is that companies themselves are using the structured data to help them with their own reporting. And we see that from the financial realm where companies benchmarking how their peers are adopting new accounting standards, right? So that they can help, that feedback can help them craft their own accounting, the accounting policy implementations. They also need to be able to benchmark their own progress along certain metrics against their peers. So companies themselves can definitely benefit from consuming the XBRL data, whether it's financial or sustainability. Now, the big question is why XBRL, right? As I said, financial disclosures in many jurisdictions are already being tagged using XBRL. As I said before, the extension of applying XBRL tagging to ESG disclosures is somewhat incremental. And it's really important for companies to also understand that, when they're tagging their sustainability reports using XBRL, they're really meeting the needs of investors and other stakeholders who need to be able to use the financial and non-financial ESG disclosures in conjunction with each other for analysis. And the key point I would like to make today is that the XBRL framework solves some very critical problems that the ESG data domain currently faces. Firstly, it's the lack of standardized data, as pointed out by the IOSCO report. And importantly, there's a lack of transparency on how the data was collected or how the ESG rating is compiled. So why XBRL, right? Well, XBRL provides rich metadata for every single data point that is tagged using XBRL. So that's the first key point. The second key point is that XBRL already has in its framework the ability for companies to tag and structure qualitative disclosures. So as the sustainability standards are evolving, and there's a lot of disclosure requirements surrounding qualitative statements, right, or disclosures of policies, for instance, like climate or human capital, diversity initiatives, etc. XBRL already has the mechanism in place to allow companies to tag that information. And finally, inherent in every single XBRL data point, there is traceback for each data point to the source location. That is something that if you're using another way of structuring data that is not XBRL, the metadata may not necessarily be embedded in the data point. So if we compare XBRL to the traditional approaches of collecting data, we have at idaciti spoken to many other data aggregators, and the sense that we get is that, there are lots of legacy methodologies of data collection. Traditionally, if the data has been collected manually, the process would be you have thousands of analysts collecting this data and inserting the data into a database. Now, what happens is that they might collect some of the metadata. They might collect the page number where the data was collected from in the PDF report, et cetera, et cetera. But the point here is that in the traditional mode of collecting data, the metadata for each data point is taken out of the document, right? And so there is that loses the traceability and transparency of each data point back to the source location. And the key point I wanted to make before was that with XBRL, part of the XBRL data point DNA is that every single data point has that full metadata for traceability back to the source location. And so when you look at an inline XBRL document, every single data point is embedded in the presentation layer. You know exactly where that particular data point comes from. And so that is one of the key advantages of XBRL. And then finally, obviously using the traditional approach of collecting data, the data, you have 1,000 analysts, it's high turnover of analysts collecting this data. So data may not be collected in a standardized way. So these are the key advantages of XBRL. Now, in terms of sort of providing some visuals, right? Here is an example of where XBRL, when you use the XBRL framework to tag data, you can see the full trace back to the source location. So here's an example coming from Adobe's CSR report in the GHG section of the CSR report. You can see on the left-hand side here, there is the 1187 for scope 3 business travel emissions. And then with XBRL data, once you click on a data point, it will take you straight back to the source location. And you can see the little green box at the bottom. That is exactly where that data point exists. And this is coming from this particular page for Adobe's 2021 CSR report in their GHG emissions section. So full traceability of every single data point back to the source location. Another sort of visual to kind of, get your imagination going, right? Here is where when you structure ESG metrics using XBRL, and you already have financial data that is structured using XBRL, you now have the advantage of being able to commingle, right, your ESG data with your financial data to gain new insights. So on the scatter plot here, you can see it's for the S&P 500 companies. You've got on the x-axis revenues, and then on the y-axis you have scope 3. So now you can start looking at large samples of companies and being able to quickly identify anomalies, right, in terms of which companies have relatively high scope 3 emissions and compared to their counterparts with similar size revenues. You can see that there's a couple of data points that stick out. And so here is the advantage again of structuring sustainability reports using XBRL. As I said, the financial data has already been structured using XBRL, and the added advantage of structuring sustainability disclosures using XBRL provides greater insight for investors and other stakeholders. The other advantage of using XBRL is that, as I mentioned before, XBRL embedded in its infrastructure allows companies to tag qualitative statements, right? And so now, if you're able to tag qualitative statements or qualitative disclosures, an investor or any data consumer can now analyze the qualitative data and quantitative data side by side. And this is really important from an investor perspective, because investors are very concerned about the potential for companies to, greenwash, right? So here's an example of Dow company, right? You can see that there's waste management disclosure, and this is basically their qualitative statements about how they are incorporating waste management strategies and initiatives in the company. And then on the other column, you see environmental remediation expense, which is a financial data point that has been tagged using XBRL. And so by clicking on one of the data points, so by clicking on that one for waste management disclosure, you can see that it will take you directly to the page for the CSR report for Dow, right, which has been structured using an XBRL framework. And you can see, the investor can see, okay, let's read and take a look at how waste management is how Dow Inc. is discussing its waste management strategies and what it's doing, what its initiatives are. And then at the same time, with one click of a button, be able to look at the environmental remediation. So this addresses a very important focus for investors. What companies are saying and how the data lines up, the financial data in particular, how that lines up. Is that a congruency or incongruency? A company saying one thing but doing something else, and that is reflected in their the financial metrics, right? And so here's another example of why XBRL, with its embedded structure allowing companies to tag qualitative statements and policies, allows investors and stakeholders to be able to do that qualitative and quantitative analysis side by side. So in conclusion, we are at a very sort of exciting time for XBRL. I think that XBRL has embedded in its infrastructure the ability to provide consistent, comparable, high-quality data, and most importantly, addressing a very key problem in the marketplace right now, transparency. As I said before, it's part of the XBRL DNA. You cannot divorce the traceback metadata from the data point. Every single data point has full traceability, and this addresses that transparency problem that the current ESG data domain is struggling with, and everyone should be jumping on the XBRL bandwagon. So with that, John, I was able to make up some time from the little technology snafu at the end. So I'm going to
Thank you so much, Christine. And I hope you're not sweating too much. There's nothing worse, is there?
I know.
At the beginning of a session and bang, the internet goes off. I think it's happened to everybody, right?
Of course. Got dogs barking, internet going off.
There you go. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very insightful, very helpful. I wanted to drill down a little bit on this traceability point. One of the things that has been announced over the past few weeks is the net zero climate utility. This is a GFANZ initiative. That's a group of financial institutions that are focused on green lending, but they're also interested in data. Mm-hmm. That seems to be very much driven by this question of inability to trace information, which is of concern, or is the central point of that IOSCO report, as well as a recent Japanese regulation, and there's regulations brewing in the European Union at least as well. Presumably, although I think you described them as legacy mechanisms that data providers are using today, aka lots of keying, That that process for now probably needs to continue because they're using surveys and they're using voluntary disclosures. But when we can see a time in the not too distant future when a significant chunk of ESG ratings, for example, it will be possible for companies that have been rated, or indeed a regulator that wants to understand the ins and outs of a rating, or indeed an investor, will be able to sort of trace back to the source each of those pieces of information. Is that kind of what you're driving at?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, the key point is that right now with the legacy data providers, I mean, they're using, old methodologies to collect the data, and they might use some, more recent sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, as I said, with XBRL, if you're using an XBRL first approach to view how to structure data, embedded in XBRL is traceability, right? Every single data point has that metadata. And when people ask me that question, can we not look at traceback? It is impossible to divorce the metadata from every single data point when you're using XBRL data, right? Or an XBRL lens to structure data. And so I think that, if you look at how companies have been collecting data using the old methodologies, it's always about keying, you're right. And when they key, they try to capture some of the, the source location. It's this document, it's this page. And still, that provides some traceability back to the data point. But with XBRL, we know with inline XBRL, you see the data point in the document on this page with the words surrounding that particular data point. It is embedded in that document. And so when you leverage the XBRL infrastructure and the mechanisms and collect data using XBRL for consumption, then with one click of a button, every single data point, you can get straight back to that page, that document, within a second.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Look, we are running out of time, so I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much for your presentations. Really appreciated. In our next session, we're really going to be diving into more of these details as we talk with members of the XBRL International Special Interest Group in this field that is looking at ways and means of improving the sustainability disclosures with digitization and specifically XBRL. So do stay tuned. We'll be back in 4 minutes to cover that one off. Thank you so much, Christine, and we will see you soon. And indeed, many of us will see you at our member assembly on Friday. Thanks again.
Thanks, John.